Okay, so this is the continuation of our study, which started with the training, discipleship, the Jesus way, or disciple making the Jesus way, and we've been in this 3 weeks with discipleship, the Jesus way, and now we're moving on toward discipleship as a model for leadership development. So we're going to kind of shift our focus. We did kind of at the end of the last study from Jesus to how the early church, and particularly Paul, um, sort of put into practice the model of Jesus, and what we see sort of ongoing in the church of the application of Jesus's methods, um, not only for raising up faithful disciples of Jesus, but for raising up leaders in the church who are faithful disciples of Jesus. And these leaders would be doing the work of the church. So, so this is, well, it all depends on how you count it. We did the disciple making the Jesus way in 3 weeks. We've spent 3 weeks in discipleship the Jesus way, sort of talking about ongoing discipleship, and now we're going to focus a little more specifically on raising up leaders within the church, and we're going to do that for 3 weeks. So this is a 9 week study, and this is session 7, or this is specifically the third module, session 1. However you want to look at that. So at the beginning of this study, it says read Acts 9:26 and 27, which says, when he came to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples. It's talking about Saul here, or Paul, before he was commonly called Saul. But they were afraid of him, not believing that he really was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles. He told them how Saul on his journey had seen the Lord, and the Lord had spoken to him, and how in Damascus he had preached fearlessly in the name of Jesus. So, number 1 on this study says Saul's conversion was suspicious to many of the disciples because he had been violently persecuting the church. Barnabas took him to the apostles and told them about his conversion and his initial ministry. So I'll just say that when we read, particularly in the book of Acts and in the epistles in the New Testament, um, we find that it was really common for a leader in the church to sort of affirm another leader in the church, or a newer leader in the church, and that in fact, often Paul did this. Paul would send somebody with a letter that affirmed his confidence in that person that was carrying the letter. And oftentimes we kind of see this as the earliest sort of ordination certificate, or the earliest ordination paperwork. So if somebody came to you and you didn't know if there's somebody that is legitimate and should be listened to by you and by the church that you're a part of, then you would look for somebody who you do trust. Your district superintendent, a former pastor, or somebody that has ministered to you before and you trust, for them to send a letter with that person that says, hey, you trust me, I trust them, you should listen to them. And so we see this with Paul. We see Paul doing this a lot. Now we see here at the beginning of Paul, who was at this point really called Saul, um, according to the early parts of his ministry, people were afraid because he had been persecuting the church. So they were like, well, he's not really a disciple. They thought this guy is trying to pretend to be a disciple so he can catch us, and have us killed. So Barnabas, who was apparently already a trusted leader in the church, brought Saul to the apostles and shared Saul's testimony of how he became a disciple from who he was before, and and how he had already begun doing ministry. Like immediately in Damascus, he had started preaching, and his ministry had had some success, and so Barnabas is sort of vouching for Saul in front of all the apostles, which will make a difference because if they affirm him, then it will matter to all of the other disciples who might not be sure if they want to listen to him or believe that he's really who he says he is. Um, so, um, this is sort of the beginning of this role of Barnabas in Saul's life, and we're going to follow that here for a little bit during this session, during this study. So discussing your groups, do you think there are ever people in the church that are being called by God, but the church doesn't accept them at first? Let me just say, in general, I would say all of us. I would say if somebody walks into our church and I don't know them, and they say, "Hey, I'm called to ministry," I don't say, "All right, awesome, go ahead and take the pulpit." Go ahead and get up and preach. And believe me, I've had people walk in and say, "Hey, I want to share a word of knowledge with the church today. Can I go ahead and do that?" And I'm like, "No, because I don't know who you are, and I don't know what your beliefs are, and I don't know what you're about to say, and I am responsible for this flock, this congregation, and what gets taught to them and making sure that they're not led astray. So I don't let just anybody speak to them from the pulpit." So yes, any of us. The first day I said that I was called to ministry, Pastor Bain didn't necessarily put me up in the pulpit the first day. There was a process of learning and examination and growth that happened before I was really, even set loose to preach under his supervision. And there was even more before I was set loose to preach without his supervision or without direct supervision. Um, so, so that's actually a normal thing. It's also true that there are some people that come with sort of unique pasts, like Saul, or perhaps different than Saul, maybe not persecuting the church, but unique enough that people are not quite sure whether this person is to be trusted. I'll never forget, somebody that we raised up in our church, Pastor Daniel Wood, was somebody who had a past that is probably not common among pastors. And there were some, even when he was first getting his local minister's license, there were some that had questions about whether he was ready for this. And it took somebody vouching for him and letting him do ministry under supervision um, before um, before he could really become the pastor that God had called him to be. And so I affirmed him, and our church board affirmed him, and we went through that process. When he moved to South Carolina, we have a formal licensing program in the Church of the Nazarene, and he was a licensed minister, and that license was able to be transferred to South Carolina. But I can tell you that when he went to South Carolina, he served under another pastor in an existing church for some time, and then his district superintendent was ready to put him in a small church to do some ministry on his own. But his district superintendent, I knew his district superintendent. We had done trainings together before, and he gave me a personal call, and he said, "Tell me a little bit about Pastor Daniel so that I understand what's going on, where he's at in his growth." And so I shared with him where I thought he was. And then The district decided to do a background check, as districts do, and the district secretary called me and said, "Hey, I would like for you to kind of explain some of this stuff that's in his background." And I said, "Yeah, I can do that. I can help with that because I know his testimony." And so for Pastor Daniel, along with, I would say, for just about anybody who's been raised up in our church in the last 14, 15 years, I became the person who vouched for him in ministry, both in our church, uh, taking him to our local church board, and as he went out into a new district and a new church. And so, at some level, sort of that's the process. You can't interview with a for ministry for a minister's license, a local minister's license with the local church board without being recommended to the local church board by the pastor. And you can't interview with the district without being recommended to the district for district license by the local church board and pastor. And so there's a process of somebody has to be your Barnabas, the one that brings you and says, "I've been mentoring this person. We've already examined them. We've already worked with them. This is their testimony." So I would say this is a normal part of our licensing and ordination process today. And we find it in Scripture in places like this. So what would it look like for us to be a Barnabas, son of encouragement? By the way, Barnabas means son of encouragement. Bar is son of, and Nabas, whatever is encouragement. So what would it look like for us to be a Barnabas to one of those young ministers? So somebody, it would be, I as the pastor do that a lot, but I've passed on a lot of that to Pastor Patty and Pastor James, Pastor Bianca in their respective ministries. And I would say that all of us, this is a part of our call. And if you were in our church on Sunday, when we were talking about um, sort of our ministry culture in our church, this was what we were focusing on. So some of this we've talked about recently. This might be a little bit of a review, maybe a little more in depth, or kind of just affirming what we've already been talking about. All right. The second part says, read Acts 11:22 through 26. This says, news of this reached the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he arrived and saw what the grace of God had done, he was glad and encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with all their hearts. He was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great number of people were brought to the Lord. Then Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. So for a whole year, Barnabas and Saul met with the church and taught great numbers of people. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. So we kind of skipped a little bit in between chapters 9 and 11, but basically what happened is the diaspora, after Stephen had been stoned, all except for the apostles left Jerusalem, and we find out that some, all of them went and shared their faith wherever they went, and a lot of that was in Jewish areas, but some went here to Antioch and shared it with the Gentiles, with Greeks, and all of a sudden we find a church being birthed, and maybe the first church to be birthed of Gentiles, and that's the significance of the church, the disciples being called Christians first at Antioch, because this was the first time they were not a Jewish sect. This is the first time it wasn't a group of Jews who happened to be disciples of our particular Jewish rabbi, Jesus. So we've gone beyond Jews who were disciples of a Jewish rabbi, and now we have Greeks who are learning about salvation and how it has come also to the Gentiles. And so they're being called something different. For the first time, they're being called Christians, which is a term that we still use to this day. So number 2 says, when the church at Jerusalem found out Laman had started a church among the Gentiles, that's the fill in the blank there, Gentiles, they sent out a trusted church leader who had been with the apostles in Jerusalem, although he was not one of the apostles. So this is somebody who had been raised up by the apostles, who was trusted by the apostles. We know he was trusted by the apostles because we know that he was able to bring Saul in front of the apostles, and so they trusted him and his word about what had happened in the life of Saul. And so we don't know exactly how trusted or what role, whether he was considered a lay leader or a pastor. There's a lot of things we don't know. But I will say this, that it says all but the apostles were scattered, and Barnabas was apparently still with the apostles at Jerusalem. Um, so here he was, um, as a part of this leadership group in Jerusalem. Um, Barnabas had already invested, that's what we want there, invested in Paul and knew about his call, so he brought him into a ministry situation that matched his call. So Barnabas goes out by himself. He was sent by the leaders at Jerusalem by himself, apparently, to the church at Antioch, and he started teaching there. A bunch of people got saved. Perhaps the church is growing and he needs his first staff member because the church has gotten big enough, it's too much for him to handle. We know there were more than one leader in the church. We know there were other teachers and prophets. We find that out later. Some of them perhaps were the same ones that started the church. We don't know. But Barnabas had already invested in Paul, knew about his call, so he went to Tarsus to find Paul, brought him back, and he's still being called Saul at this point in the text. And number 4 says, many people think of Paul in his maturity as an early church leader, but these early passages in Acts show that Barnabas was the one investing in Saul following his conversion. So when we think of Paul, sort of we look back and we think of like the whole scripture as if it happened on the same day. And so we have these snapshots of Paul's ministry. So we think of him on the first day as every bit as sort of mature in his ministry as he was at the beginning. But that's not actually true. That's not how it works. So if we read the text and interpret it properly, what we see is that Barnabas is the more mature leader who had to take Saul to the apostles when he wasn't being accepted, and now has gone to Tarsus to find him and bring him back into a ministry that matches what Paul's call was. So we know that he was called to be God's chosen instrument for the Gentiles, and so now Barnabas is here in what seems to be the first Gentile church, and he says that's what Saul's called to. I got to go get him. So he went and got him from Tarsus and brought him here. So discuss in your groups, do you think Barnabas needed to go find Saul? I think this might be a confusing question or contextual question. So maybe Barnabas needed support. Maybe the church had grown to the point that he needed somebody. But we hear that he already had people within that church who were sort of raising up as leaders, as prophets, as teachers. So I would say that probably um, Barnabas didn't need to, at least in the context that a lot of us as pastors don't feel like we need to raise up other leaders because we feel like it's a lot longer and harder to raise up another leader than it is to just do the work yourself sometimes. So I would think it would be easy for him to say he didn't need to, but he knew about Saul's call. He probably understood that it might take twice as much work to raise somebody up now, but in the long run, it's going to be more effective to do ministry with other people and not by yourself. Um, so he recognized, I think, I would say he did need to, but I think he recognized the need that perhaps some of us don't recognize. Um, the next question in the discussion says, why do you think Saul was in Tarsus? So I don't know. Perhaps he was there doing the work that God had called him to do. There were Gentiles there, and perhaps he was there speaking to the Gentiles. We do know that this was his hometown, so maybe he had returned home to tend to some family matters. We don't know. Maybe he was discouraged. Maybe people still were not accepting him in Jewish areas because of all the things that he had done to the Christians, to the disciples. So maybe he had decided to just sort of go and find a place where he is accepted, and maybe he was doing ministry, maybe he was moping. We don't really know. But Barnabas felt that it was something that he needed to be brought into this church in Antioch. Why do you think he went to find Saul instead of just investing the church in the church himself, like the church in Jerusalem had sent him to do? So the church in Jerusalem had sent Barnabas. We don't read anything about them saying, hey, go find Saul. He should really be involved in this. We don't really read anything about them saying anybody needed to be raised up. But apparently Barnabas was the sort of person that sort of naturally encouraged others in ministry, it seems like. So he had done some work and he realized he needed more. He went and got Saul. Um, so there, we're trying. I know that there's some assumptions being made because we are not told about why Saul is in Tarsus. We're not told about whether Barnabas was given instructions to get Saul or whether he just did it on his own. We're not told much about Barnabas at all and what his sort of role was, what his experience was. But I think there's a lot of things that we can infer here as we read that we see Barnabas seems to really be, when we look at Paul's ministry, we see that Paul raises, not only does he preach the gospel in many places, but he also raises up leaders more prolifically than any other apostle that we learn about. We don't hear about any other apostle raising up leaders at the level that Paul raised them up. Perhaps it was just because Paul had to, because he was preaching in so many areas and people were coming to Christ and he needed pastors. It doesn't really tell us, but we see Paul's um, leadership development very strongly in the Acts and the epistles. But I would say that Paul learned it from somebody and it started before him. And it started because we can see it with Barnabas and Barnabas's investment in Paul. So that's kind of where Paul's amazing leadership development process seems to have been learned by the investment that Barnabas made in him. And honestly, any of us that invest in leadership development You can almost be sure that we had somebody else invest in us, and that's how we learned it. We didn't just come up with it on our own. Although I do know a few pastors that invest in leadership development despite not having somebody invest in them as much as they should, and have told me, I want to do for others what was not done for me. And I honestly, I could probably give you both of those testimonies, because I know in my church growing up, I expressed a call to ministry and I was not invested in or raised up into leadership. But when I came to Sandia, I was again hearing the call of God, and I was invested in. So I know the difference. Um, all right. Um, Read Acts 13, 1 through 3. That says, Now in the church at Antioch there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. So number 5 says, The call of God came while the church and its leaders were worshiping the Lord and fasting. And those are the fill in the blanks there. Number 6 says, The call of God for missions work, I have that in quotes, came to all of the leaders and not just those who were called. So, in other words, what we're seeing is that it wasn't just Saul and Barnabas that said, that God said to them, I'm calling you. But rather, Saul and Barnabas, we believe, heard God say, I'm calling you. But the people around them heard God say, um, that you need to set apart for me Saul and Barnabas. So, in other words, if you are being called by God, the chances are God is also speaking to godly people around you, other pastors and leaders around you. And so you might say, well, God told me this, but I don't want anybody else to know. I'm not going to tell anybody. I got news for you. If you don't tell anybody, people will still know if you've got people around you who are listening to God. So if you got somebody, if you know in the back of your mind, you're like, I know I've been called, but I'm trying to run, I'm trying to get away from it, and you got somebody in the church that keeps bugging you and says, you're called too, aren't you? I see in you um, the gifts and graces for ministry that God usually gives to those who are called. It's not because they just bug. It's because they are hearing from God, just like you have heard from God, and you should see it as an affirmation of the call that you've already heard. Number 7 says, as was clear in chapter 11, Barnabas is still listed before Saul when they were called to be set apart for the work of God. In other words, it still says, set apart for me Saul, or Barnabas and Saul. And we don't hear, we often in the church say Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas. But I want to point out that at this point, it is still saying in the text, not Paul and Barnabas, but Barnabas and Saul. And who is listed first is not usually by accident in Scripture. It is who takes precedence in the leadership or authority that is listed first. So discuss in your groups, do you think this gives us insight into how God calls Christian leaders? So, yes, God calls, first of all, if we're not worshiping and fasting, if we're not praying, then chances are we're not going to hear the voice of God. Second of all, if we all are worshiping the Lord, fasting and praying, then chances are that not only the person who is called is going to hear, but the other people of God around them are going to know about the call, sometimes simultaneously. I would say sometimes people in the church know about your call before you do. And more often than not, that's probably because they're listening better than you are, or they're more willing to accept it than you are. But I believe God still calls in this way. God calls a person, but if you say, I'm called by God, and everybody around you says, no, not to that you're not, um, maybe there's something to that. Maybe you're not really hearing God. Maybe you're, on the flip side, if you say, no, I'm not called, and everybody says, keep saying it, you can keep saying it, that doesn't make it true. Then maybe you're not hearing God as well as they are. Now, I try as a pastor, not God calls people to ministry, not me. But I feel like when somebody comes to me and says, Pastor, I think I'm being called into Christian ministry as a pastor, I'm almost never surprised. And if I am surprised, it's probably not because I'm surprised. It's probably because I'm thinking, no, I don't see the gifts and graces for ministry in you. And I think that you're out to look for leadership and attention for yourself. And I'm not going to affirm that in you. And so that does happen too. So do you think the call comes in similar ways today? I think so. I absolutely think that the call of God looks very similar today than it did as it did in this situation to what it did in this situation in Acts. Okay, read Acts 15:36 through 16:5. Again, if you have been with us through module 2. In other words, there's some overlap here. We're reading part of this text has already been read by us in the last study in module 2, session 3. So it says, sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, notice the switch there, both to Paul as well as Paul being the one that initiates and in this situation and says something to Barnabas. It seems like the leadership is shifting. Let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they are doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them, but Paul did not think it wise to take him, because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Let me just say that a lot of attention is given to the disagreement, and I'm not sure how much attention is given to the fact that when they were sent off, the believers affirmed and commended them to the work of the Lord. And so there's something to God's affirmation of this plan, and not just sort of that human disagreement. Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but his father was Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of him. Paul wanted to take him along on the journey, so he circumcised him because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was Greek. As they traveled from town to town, they delivered the decisions reached by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem for the people to obey. So the churches were strengthened in the faith and grew daily in numbers. So I got a lot to say about that. We're going to break that down here. Number 8, it was Paul's idea now to go back and visit the believers in all the towns where they had preached the word of the Lord and see how they were doing. So we see Paul sort of taking the lead now. He had been sort of fostered by Barnabas. He had been raised up. He had been encouraged. He had been trained and taught. And now Paul was saying, now I'm feeling that it's my call to go back and do these things. Encourage these people and not just to leave them to their own devices after they have given their lives to the Lord. Number 9, Paul and Barnabas had a disagreement at this point, but it wasn't about whether to go and do the work. It was about who they should invest their energies in raising up for the work. The outcome of this disagreement was that Barnabas took John Mark and Paul took Silas. So the outcome, the plan became that each of them took a different person to raise up. Um, and then number 10 says, when Paul came to Lystra, he was introduced to a young disciple named Timothy, and Paul decided also to take him along for the journey. Discuss in your group, do you think one of these men, Paul or Barnabas, was right? I just think whenever we talk about a disagreement, this is where we default to. Who's right? Um, was Paul wrong about this? You know what? I mean, in my experience, um, sometimes people need grace. Sometimes people make mistakes when they enter into ministry, and they need grace and they need support. And I'm somebody who sort of falls on the side of Barnabas. And I think it should not be a surprise to us that Barnabas, the one who took Saul by the hand when he was not accepted, is now the one that defends John Mark. Now, we know that John Mark was probably like a cousin of Barnabas, so there was relation there. But I don't think that it's a coincidence that Barnabas is the person that feels like John Mark needs another chance. He seems to be the compassionate one that works with people that nobody else wants to work with. We know a little bit just from reading about Paul, from Paul's writings and from the book of Acts, as Paul was described, that Paul was a little bit more assertive, a little bit maybe not quite as gracious sometimes as somebody like Barnabas was, which is ironic since Paul's considered the sort of the apostle of grace, and the book of Romans is pointed to as affirming. Sometimes people think affirming the more greasy grace, which I don't agree with. But um, Paul was usually the person that had a lot firmer accountability. We also know that Paul was the younger in the faith of the two. And so Barnabas, I think I mentioned this when I was talking about this a little bit on Sunday, that I often see this, that when I raise somebody up, and then we talk about somebody else we're trying to raise up, the person I've raised up is normally a lot more judgmental and I want to hold this person accountable than I am. And I'm sitting here looking at the person that I had so much grace for, and watching them struggle to have grace for this other person. And the person I've had so much grace for thinks that sort of they were raised up pretty easily because they didn't need that much grace, and that's just not true. And so the more mature person in the faith, the person that's been in the faith longer or been in Christian leadership longer, often sees sort of that distinction. So I wonder if Barnabas wasn't looking at Paul and saying, Paul, I get what you're saying. Don't you even realize what it took to get you raised up? That you needed somebody to hold your hand, or nobody would have even accepted you. So now here, John Mark made a mistake, but we need to give him another chance. Paul, like, no. And so Barnabas says, all right, you take who you want to take, and I'm going to take John Mark. And you don't have to invest in him, but I'm going to. And I honestly, um, when Jesus said to the teachers of the law, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, and we see those who were accusers leave, and it tells us that the elders left first. I think that we think that through, and we realize the older and more mature the teachers of the law were, the more they recognized how much grace they had needed and how much grace other people had needed. And we have this tendency, I think, to give more grace as we mature in age. And so I don't think this should be a surprise to us that Paul was a little bit firmer and a little bit less likely to to accept John Mark after he's failed them. But Barnabas, the more mature of the two, he decides, I'm going to take John Mark. You go take Silas. So we have that. And now, that being said, Paul wants to take Timothy. Timothy's spoken well of all across the group. And Timothy was obviously very committed, because we find out that Paul says, well, everybody knows your dad's Greek, so you're probably not circumcised, and there's a lot of Jews in the area that aren't gonna accept you, and so if I'm gonna take you in and try to get you accepted as a minister of the gospel, you need to get circumcised. And Timothy was willing to go through that process. I mean, boy, he's less likely to desert them two or three towns in, isn't he? Because at this point, Timothy he's invested here. There was a high barrier to entry to this ministry, and he has paid the price up front. So this says, do you think Barnabas's history with Paul that we've already talked about may give us some insight into his defense of John Mark? Absolutely. I think we learn something about the character of Barnabas, and the maturity of Barnabas, and we can compare that to what we know about Paul, not only in his firmness about accountability, but also in his relative maturity, and time in the faith. And so, yeah, so this is where we're going to start. We've got two more studies in this, to talk about the process of raising up leaders in the church that we see through Paul, that we believe Paul learned from Barnabas and ultimately was learned from Jesus himself. And so we're going to continue this study as we go forward.